Delegate Lopez.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Question for the Secretary Designate.
Okay.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Hello to a fellow Eagle Scout. I think there are only 2 of us in the House of Delegates now, so we keep dwindling. Yeah, just a quick statement and then a couple questions. You had said, actually, that you were on the Senate Committee on Environment and Public Works. You were the chief counsel. The chairman at that time was Senator James Inhofe of Oklahoma, who is famous for being the chief climate change denier in the U.S. Senate. So I just want to make that clear. Under your leadership at the EPA, it appeared as if you were intentionally trying to dismantle the agency and eliminate EPA safeguards. You went out of your way to undermine EPA's role to protect public health and the environment. In just your first 12 months, Mr. Wheeler, you sidelined scientists, you proposed to restrict the use of scientific data, you gutted the coal ash rule, you recommended unsafe levels of drinking water contaminants, you rolled back Clean Water Act protections, you suppressed an inconvenient formaldehyde report which concluded that it would cause leukemia and nose and throat cancer. You ignored EPA scientists' advice to ban asbestos. You weakened the mercury emissions rule. You slammed vehicle emissions rules into reverse. You rescinded the Clean Power Plan, whose goal was to dramatically cut carbon emissions, which was a gift to the coal industry. And to make matters worse, for folks who care deeply about the Chesapeake Bay, you proposed a 90% cut in funding for EPA's Chesapeake Bay program. The Union of Concerned Scientists wrote that that was just in your first 12 months at EPA. That EPA Administrator Andrew Wheeler has killed or weakened dozens of safeguards with the sole intention of bolstering polluting industries' profit margins, even after Congress slashed the corporate tax rate. As a result, millions of Americans will be drinking filthier water and breathing dirtier air, and more will suffer from serious diseases, according to EPA's own accounting. Before you became EPA Administrator in 2019, 3 former Republican EPA administrators, William Riley, Lee Thomas, and Christine Todd Whitman, warned the public about your becoming their successor. My question is, why shouldn't every Virginia environmentalist or person who cares about renewable energy or parent who cares about their children not breathing dirty air or drinking or having clean drinking water be scared out of their mind that you might potentially become the Secretary of Natural Resources and have sway over the DEQ?
Well, first of all, you raised a number of issues, and I would love to address every single one of them, and I'll be happy to meet with you to go over each of the ones on your list. But there's a few in particular that I do want to address, but all of them are inaccuracies as far as the record. We cleaned up the air, 7% reduction in air. Water quality when I left office was the cleanest it's been in the country. I protected children's health through the lead and copper rule that I just mentioned. I do want to just hit on the Bay funding, the asbestos, and the formaldehyde. If you'd like me to address any of the other accusations, happy to do those. On the Bay funding, you're referring to the Bay funding for the Chesapeake Bay geographic program, which was $82 million. There are about a dozen geographic programs across the country. None of them were ever authorized by Congress. OMB at the White House cut the funding for all of those geographic programs, and knowing that the Congress would restore the funding. That was only $82 million. Most of that went to staff salaries in the building, which I knew would already be paid for anyway, regardless of what was in the budget. But what I also knew was that $82 million is not enough to clean up the Bay. So while that political dispute was going on, I don't consider myself a politician. I'm more of a technocrat. While that political debate was going on between the White House and Congress, I looked to provide funding for the Bay programs, and I secured over $500 million in different programs, including $220 million for Hampton Roads, $202 million for their sanitation project, actually their water reuse project that they're injecting the reused water back into the aquifer $202 million for the city of Baltimore for a new wastewater treatment facility to stop the CSO from going into the bay. Millions of dollars for farmers in Pennsylvania, because that's one of the largest problems that we have left for addressing the bay issues of the farmers in Pennsylvania. And the Hampton Roads actually was over $1 billion. $220 million has already been delivered to them, but they already have the authority to go back for the rest of the money as they need it. So overall, although $500 million in the 2-year period that I was administrator, I committed to over $1 billion in programs to clean up the bay, which is, compared to the $82 million that was a political fight, I thought it was more important to get the projects completed that will get the bay cleaned up. On formaldehyde, I did not suppress a report. There was a it's called an IRIS risk assessment that has no regulatory impact at all. It had been mired in scientific politics between different scientists at different agencies, different offices within the EPA, as well as other federal departments. What I did was I put formaldehyde on the list, the TSCA list, for it to be reviewed as one of the first 20 chemicals under the new TSCA law that can end up in regulations. So I had the choice between spending a lot of time and capital on a risk assessment that was not really going anywhere, or actually putting it in the hands of the people that can make a regulation to limit the use of formaldehyde. And I chose to put it on the regulatory track instead of putting more resources on a track that the agency had spent over 15 years on the risk assessment, and it still wasn't finished. I thought it was more important to put it in the regulatory track instead. On asbestos, we actually moved to close the loopholes on asbestos. Currently, under current law, you can still import some products that contain asbestos. It's not been banned. All aspects of asbestos has not been banned. I had to be careful when I was the EPA administrator not to prejudge a regulatory decision when you start a process, because then it's grounds for being overturned in court. I'm no longer the EPA administrator, so I can say that I put asbestos on the track to be completely banned across the country, closing a loophole that had been in place since the early 90s when the George H.W. Bush administration tried to ban asbestos, and the court struck down half of their regulatory approach. But I can go down the list of the other issues that you raised if you like, but there's a lot of misinformation about what I did at the agency, and I stand by my record that the environment improved under my watch. And on the EPA side, I did not try to dismantle the agency. By my last year, we were onboarding more people than were leaving the agency. When I got to the agency, over 40% of the workforce was eligible to retire. And so I hired a new human resources director, and we created some new creative programs to try to get more scientists into the agency to replace the ones that were retiring. I pledged to the EPA employees on day number 1 that I would leave the agency stronger than I found it, and I did.
One final...
Delegate Lopez, you had a follow-up question.
Yes, one final follow-up.
I would simply note we do have quite a number of folks in the queue. We've spent almost half the time that we spent with Secretary Lord. There are limits for each of us. So if you can be
very brief,
as concise in your questions, that will, I think, will help all of us to have a conversation.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Delegate Lopez.
We can definitely have a conversation anytime over coffee and get into the weeds on a lot of these issues. The one point I'd like to make, though, is that because of the failed efforts regarding the Chesapeake Bay and the issues that D.C. and Maryland and Virginia had with the cleanup efforts that were not happening, they actually took you and the agency to court, and then you referred to that lawsuit as frivolous. There are definitely more facts about each of the things we've talked about, but we'd love to have that conversation. I'd love to have a conversation offline.
Absolutely. The lawsuit that was filed by Maryland and Virginia and D.C. was over New York and Pennsylvania not meeting their 2025 WIP obligations. Virginia and Maryland were not meeting their WIP obligations either. And I said at the time that it would be better if we all worked together to try to get all the states to meet the WIP obligations instead of having to spend a lot of time and resources litigating it in court. So yes, I did think the lawsuit was inappropriate at the time because we need to work together, all the states in the Bay Commission. But Virginia and Maryland, when they filed the lawsuit, neither one were meeting their WIP obligations.
All right.